American military history naturally explains the history of military affairs on this continent, but it can also be used to elucidate the American character and explain America's origins. Some see in colonial military history evidence of an Atlantic cultural divide, so two cultures growing apart. For others, like myself, American military history presents the Atlantic not as a barrier, but as a bridge that facilitated greater Anglicization or greater cultural cohesion during the colonial era, greater cultural cohesion between England and its American colonies. So much of American scholars on the colonial era focuses on the cultural and political transformation of Englishmen into Americans in 13 of Britain's American colonies. And this is one way to solve the problem of why on earth would these people rebel? And so as the argument goes, at some point during the colonial era, American Englishmen became qualitatively distinct, culturally, ethically, ideologically, from English Englishmen. And that explains the increased friction between these colonies and their mother country. In the field of military history, this investigation, this narrative has produced histories depicting the colonists as American frontiersmen fighting as irregulars, okay, avoiding large-scale, highly coordinated combat of the European style, and instead adopting adopting the military practice of small, open-ordered forces engaging in the field. And so again, within this military, what you see from this military narrative is that same message you get overall in trying to explain the American Revolution. And that is the message that living in America, and in this case, fighting in America, had a transformative effect on English settlers, transforming them from what they were as conventional Englishmen relying on conventional defensive tactics, on European tactics, transforming them into something uniquely American. Okay, so the idea is that the colonial era saw the emergence of a uniquely American way of war. Understandably, this storyline of colonial troops evolving from defensive-minded collectivists to offensive-minded individualists has been used as an allegory for a much wider cultural transformation that explains not only the American victory in the War of Independence, but also the birth of American nationhood, the birth of the American character, American identity, and American separatism from England. In a book on this topic, I point out that the settlers' military experiences in America, their ordeals in America, did not lead them to a reevaluation and transformation of their military or tactical doctrine. They remained committed to the accepted principles of European warfare: massed deployment of troops and defensive tactics. Okay, mass deployment, massed fire, defensive tactics. Their military manuals, their training, and their actions in the field indicate that settlers did not adopt a new and more offensive philosophy of war, but that over time, lack of funds and lack of training prevented colonial forces from executing their conventional, conservative European military doctrine effectively in battle situations. And in fact, it was this poor performance of colonial forces that led colonial officials to colonial governments to address the shortcomings of their own military establishments by greater reliance on British forces and the British Treasury and imperial administrators. And so the degree of British military involvement in America, in American wars, increased from war to war to war in the 18th century, culminating in the French and Indian War, which was a European war carried out in North America. So, so this debate is about American forces' adjustment or lack of adjustment to American conditions. But the British Army's light infantry has become enmeshed in this American debate through no fault of its own. The formation of light infantry units during the French and Indian War. Okay, the light infantry units were companies within the British infantry. They were made up of, so basically each regiment contributed a contingent to form a light infantry corps. And these British infantrymen were trained to serve as scouts and flankers and skirmishers. Okay. So the formation of these light infantry units is presented by some as evidence of the incompatibility of European military conventions and American conditions. Okay, that here you have evidence that even the British Army, when fighting in North America, had to unlearn or to change its method from fighting the way it did in Europe and adopt a uniquely American method suited for American conditions. In fact, when you look at the literature, you can see that Britain's light infantry, because of this, is even a more potent asset in the hands of the proponents of American tactics or the American way of war than even provincial rangers like Benjamin Church or Robert Rogers, because when they discuss the Rangers, these historians cannot tell us how and when these new Americanized Americanized new military culture of the frontier rangers traveled eastward and took over colonial military establishments and shaped the attitudes of future generations of American commanders. It's hard to demonstrate such Western influence in the East because we know that colonial military establishments and later the US Army did not buy into this alleged American way of war. So their conduct on the field and their training practices tell us that these institutions remained committed to the principles of, or the conventions, principles and conventions of positional warfare, the European way of war. The British Army's formation of light infantry offers what Rangers and American armies cannot, and that is an instance in which this frontier military martial culture, this supposedly new way of war, took root in an Eastern establishment, the British Army, and reshaped it. I don't have the time. I got a menacing note about not exceeding the time limit. So I'm not going to offer all the evidence I can think of for this. I'll just focus on 2 or 3. Classic military literature like J.F.C. Fuller's British Light Infantry in the 18th century and Eric Robeson's British Light Infantry in the mid-18th century discuss the effect of American conditions, and both point to uniquely American factors that force the British Army to adjust and change its ways just as provincial establishments had adjusted in previous colonial wars by creating ranger units. And modern historians concur. Most recently, well, not recently anymore, but most famously, John Grenier. Other historians, however, are skeptical about how unique and unprecedented these American challenges were, starting with Stanley Pargellis and ranging on to Peter Russell, Peter Paré, Daniel Beatty, and others. The rub here between these camps is whether the new light infantry units of the French and Indian War were irregulars fighting according to a new, more dynamic, mobile, flexible, and offensive tactical doctrine, which is what the Americanization thesis would argues, or whether they were operating within the conventional European tactical doctrine of defensive and positional warfare, trying to secure advantageous positions from which to repel attackers, rather than seeking out and attacking enemy forces in order to destroy them. Okay? The conduct of the army during the French and Indian War demonstrates that British generals were convinced of the efficacy of European tactics on the battlefields of North America. Nevertheless, they saw great value in light troops as scouts and auxiliaries. So throughout the war, the British attempted to create a reliable force of auxiliaries to perform special assignments for which British regulars were traditionally untrained or unsuited. In 1755 and 56, at the beginning of the French and Indian War, it was Robert Rogers and his Rangers. His missions involved gathering intelligence, seizing captives for intelligence and for future negotiations, destroying supplies, and harassing small enemy units. Okay, what's called petite guerre, described as the hardy byplay of war. Like ranger forces of earlier colonial wars and like Indian war bands, Rogers' troops enjoyed a somewhat inflated reputation in the popular press at the time. They were often ineffective tactically, even in minor skirmishes and encounter battles. Again, forgive me for the lack of examples. Time is pressing. And I offer a lot of details on this in the book. But despite their limitations as a fighting force, Ranger units were quite useful and effective in gathering intelligence on enemy deployment and movement and in destroying enemy provisions. The problem was that Ranger units such as Rogers tended to be unruly and unreliable. Okay? Oftentimes, they simply dispersed before completing their missions. They offered fabricated intelligence, disregarded schedules, and more often than not, refused to take part in tedious business or tedious duties like camp construction and fortification. And so these factors made it difficult for British commanders to include Rangers in missions that involved concerted actions between units. And quotations on this from frustrated British generals abound. But more disturbing than the Rangers' poor soldiery was the fact that they were exorbitantly expensive. The provincial soldier, and especially a Ranger, cost much more than a redcoat. And that's because the American labor market was always, still is today, a seller's market. And this is why North America still is such a tremendous draw for labor. The wages here have always been high. Okay. Once war broke out, competition between provincial armies and private employers jacked up the wages for both. Okay. So in Europe, the pay for soldiers was relatively low because the pay for laborers was relatively low. In America, in order to draw a soldier from the farm to the army, you had to You had to match the high wages in the civilian market. And so these Rangers had their limitations, and they were super duper expensive. And these frustrations with Rangers led General Loudon, as Commander-in-Chief of British forces, to initiate the training of experienced British regulars in light infantry tactics, and drawing up light infantry companies within the infantry regiments. And in 1757, he also formed a full regiment of light troops. The regular army was induced to take into its own hands a greater share of the prosecution of irregular military activities, because hopes that provincials might be relied on to perform these duties was not realized. Okay? Loudon explained the creation of regular light infantry companies as an attempt to gain self-sufficiency in such small-scale operations. And he said that he was convinced that until the British Army had everything necessary for carrying on the war in America within itself, independent of assistance from provincials, the war will go poorly, as it did before he was appointed. Okay, so he, instead of relying on Americans to do these, again, the scouting, et cetera, he wanted to rid himself of relying on Americans, and therefore the solution was to get British soldiers to do the same thing for cheap. And this reliance on light infantry for various aspects of again, auxiliary service, again, raiding enemy supplies, harassing, petite guerre, raiding, destroying supplies, harassing enemy forces, skirmishes, supply protection, foraging, scouting, etc. This kind of petite guerre was not a novelty for European armies. Like most armies in Europe, the British had utilized these kinds of units as auxiliaries to their regular troops long before the French and Indian War, including hiring riflemen, rifle companies for sniping. Peter Parry, who's a military historian, has written extensively on this. And John Grenier, in his book, has an excellent discussion of European partisans in his book. So hiring skirmishers and scouters and snipers, etc., was an accepted European practice with a long history, born of the dynamics of war in Europe rather than a novel response to American conditions. As European armies increased in size and European wars increased in scope during the 18th century, so did the size and scope of these irregular units in Europe. And especially important in this respect was the enhanced role of artillery in European warfare, because larger artillery trains attracted more harassment from enemy cavalry and light infantry, and therefore garnered added protection against by light troops. So against a strong and disciplined defensive line, especially behind defensive works, such small and loosely deployed skirmishers had little chance of success or survival, for that matter. The defensive lines, defensive volleys, were a destructive force that was easily able to scatter a band of skirmishers if the defenders were set in their formations and facing the attackers. So it fell to light. So the mission of light troops, acting as auxiliaries to the heavy defensive formations, was to keep track of the movements of the enemy and be these like feelers to warn the main body of imminent attacks from the flanks. And they were expected to to keep these attackers occupied for a little bit, to harass them and slow their progress, thus allowing the large formations more time to set up in their defensive positions and direct themselves towards this new direction of attack. So these partisans, or these light forces in Europe, acted in concert with the main force and were part of the defensive deployment or defensive mindset of European commanders. Light troops were required for this purpose, especially when the army was on the march, because large armies required considerable time to transform themselves from a marching force to a fighting force, okay, from columns to ranks. British commanders who had served in Europe before their service in America were familiar with such practices and tactics, with light infantry. Officers were educated by experience and by their military manuals in the methods by which to defend themselves and their supplies against the actions of enemy light forces, enemy irregulars. Success in conducting such small-scale operations against Canadian forces was the result of the application of lessons learned over time in Europe to warfare in America. So the successful operation of the British Army in the French and Indian War was based on conventions learned in European warfare and applied to the American theater. The novelty of light infantry in America was the use of British regulars as light infantry and partisans and rangers. Because in Europe, more often than not, English generals on campaign simply hired locals or foreign mercenary war bands for these auxiliary purposes, for these light infantry assignments. In North America, they started off that way. Again, hiring provincials for these jobs, assuming that they'd be reliable, good, and everything else. But they proved to be problematic in terms of actions in the field. But most important, they proved to be exorbitantly expensive. And so as the war continued in North America, the British relied more and more heavily on British regulars to do these jobs, because the locals were deemed either not equal to the task or simply too expensive for the task. It wasn't worth the money to use Americans for these jobs. General Braddock, for example, the first commander-in-chief in the French and Indian War, was instructed to enlist Indians for his expedition against Fort Duquesne to serve as scouts and flanking parties to warn his army of imminent attack of enemy forces. However, because he was unable to retain their services, people they weren't willing to campaign with them, Braddock instead was forced to deploy his own men as flankers. And except for that one fatal exception, on the day of, when his force was attacked, he took the steps recommended by the European manuals to protect his army and discourage enemy ambush. He marched his army between advance and rear guards. He sent out detachments as flankers to defend heights commanding the route, and set up defensively behind makeshift obstructions. The day that he was attacked, he didn't do this for a variety of reasons, doesn't matter why now. But the point is that European manuals laid out for officers how to use light troops when a threat existed of an ambush or an encounter battle. And this is really the critical difference between the operations of British light infantry in America and in Europe, and the operations of Indian troops or colonial rangers. Because for the most part, the British Army did not use light troops as offensive fighting forces. Rather than targeting enemy troops, the objective of the Army's light infantry was to gather intelligence and to secure advantageous positions for the benefit of the larger formations, the heavy formations of the regular infantry. Again, I wish I had time to quote to you these military treatises, but I don't have time, so please trust me on this. British light infantry units cannot be characterized as equivalents of Rangers or guerrillas. Okay? These were not offensive-minded units. They were deployed to defend the infantry battalions and to allow them the time and security to set up and bring their full firepower to bear in an engagement. You see this defensive deployment, for example, during the siege of Louisbourg, and in the two campaigns against Fort Duquesne, and in the Battle of Bushy Run and in Pontiac's Rebellion, just to name a few famous ones. And their narrowly defined assignment as auxiliaries to the heavy infantry dictated a reliance on defensive tactics. As one of those military treatises explains, the light infantry's mission was to repel the enemy's Indian forces and irregulars. Okay? To repel them, not to attack them, not to pursue them, not to target them. As the support troops to the fire-producing units of the heavy infantry and the artillery, light companies were instructed to protect other forces or other positions that offered military advantages. So the point is that that British light infantry were part of a larger military scheme. They were trained to act in concert with those around them tactically, to maintain their position and formation under attack in order to defend territory. That is not guerrilla. Now, when fighting independently, not as auxiliaries to larger infantry formations, light infantry units could assume the role of an offensive shock troops. But these units were not regularly used for detached fighting in America. They were usually, again, I can't give you statistics, but their normal usage was as auxiliaries, as was their traditional role on European battlefields. For some, the British light infantry validates the storyline of American tactics. Again, uniquely American conditions forcing the adoption of uniquely American combat practices. And this military storyline fits neatly with a broader telling by some of the buildup towards American separatism and American independence. A storyline of Americanization, of unique conditions, creating a unique culture, alienated over time from the mother culture. Atlantic history, on the one hand, and local community studies on the other, have challenged this approach to colonial and revolutionary history. Like many other facets of colonial life, colonial military history reflects strong currents of Anglicization, much more than Americanization. Early Americanists early American historians have demonstrated the growing dominance in America, in the American colonies, of English goods, English fashions, English business practices, political ideologies, English jurisprudence, English bureaucratic and financial practices, English manners, religious beliefs, religious styles of devotion. So again, I think that modern scholarship more and more suggests that the Atlantic was a bridge, not a barrier. And what this suggests then is that it's time to relieve the light infantry of its role as a standard bearer for the American way of war thesis. The debate on Americanization is a debate worth having, but the British light infantry does not belong in it. Thank you.